Okay, there you go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This is the Peninsula campaign, Why the American Civil War Wasn't Won Quickly. This is part 4. The Illusion of a Short World. Oh, okay, never mind. Sorry. The last one I released was a month ago. 1 and 2 I did out of order. You click that thumbs up for me, subscribe to the channel, and you can donate to the channel through the thanks button. If you request a video like this, your name would be sponsoring this video. Okay? This is going to be a two-parter because it's over 25 minutes. So let's get into it.
Both sides had assumed that the war would be over in one swift, decisive clash. Bull Run had been neither and was instead humiliating. The amateurish ineptitude of both the soldiers and officers involved was as shocking as the 4,700 casualties. It finally began to dawn on everyone that this war would be far more difficult than anticipated, and a far more dedicated war effort was needed. Both armies began to reorganize and professionalize, preparing for the battles to come. With Richmond and Washington, D.C. only 108 miles apart, both sides believed that the Eastern Theater would decide the war. In 1862, the Union had a clear strategic advantage, but would miss its best chance to win the war quickly, thanks to one general's dithering indecisiveness. In this latest video in our series on the American Civil War, we will focus on the Eastern Campaign and missteps made by the Union that ensured the conflict would drag out into the bloodiest in American history. But a dragged-out conflict exciting is just the symbol of facing characters gear self-prepares with the Sun Wukong deal action or General Run, General Joseph Johnson. Despite his victory at Bull Run, General Joseph Johnson, commander of the Department of Virginia, had grave concerns about the Confederate military. He'd been the pre-war Army's quartermaster general and was acutely aware of the Confederacy's deficiencies versus the North's industrial capacity. About 20% of the regular Army's officers had defected alongside their states, and the Confederacy's soldiers were eager to fight. However, their ability was severely limited. All Confederate soldiers were supposed to carry Lee-Enfield rifled muskets and wear the same equipment and uniforms as the pre-war US Army, except in cadet grade. In reality, the rebels were never able to produce enough uniforms or import enough weapons to meet that standard. Instead, they used a hodgepodge of dyed state militia uniforms and equipment. The 1841 Harper's Ferry rifled musket was the most common weapon. Rations were often late and lacking. The only military resource in great supply was morale. Despite his best efforts, Johnson had no solution. There was no centralized command structure, as the states wanted some control over Confederate forces in their territories. Having seceded as sovereign and independent republics, they expected to be treated accordingly. Therefore, the Confederate military was divided into mostly independent military districts, each expected to defend its assigned states and draw supplies from them. Johnson was limited in the resources Virginia could volunteer, with the Confederate government giving minimal help. Jefferson Davis was an experienced legislator, but that experience was limited to defending slavery and the Southern status quo. He had no experience governing. He refused to delegate and habitually micromanaged, severely hampering governmental effectiveness. Throughout the war, Davis's constant interference caused 10 cabinet resignations. It also ruined his relationship with Johnson, as the two quarreled over everything, and Davis frequently gave orders to individual unit commanders, destroying Johnson's chain of command. The cabinet was filled with unqualified functionaries, chosen to protect their home state's interests. For example, Treasury.
Okay, not to nitpick or anything, but something didn't seem right. That is Joseph E. Johnston, not Johnson. Just a quick correction. And Ulysses S. Grant had very, 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 very high regard for him. He was very good. Jefferson Davis just didn't like him. They just butted heads. That was on that was on Davis, not Johnston.
Secretary Christopher Memminger knew nothing about banking, but South Carolina wanted to control that department through him. Davis's only consistently competent advisor was Judah Benjamin. From civil servants up to Davis himself, the men in government were undistinguished at best and incompetent and brainless political flunkies at worst. Davis's government was so inept that it never even established a war strategy beyond defend the Confederacy. These facts might explain why Davis's first economic policy aided the Union. On April 19th, US President Abraham Lincoln declared southern ports blockaded and closed. While the Navy wasn't actually able to enforce the blockade, southern trade still fell as European merchants shied away from dealing in contraband. The cotton trade remained the South's primary industry, supplying 77% of Britain's and 90% of France's cotton needs. Southerners universally believed in the power of King Cotton and wanted to use it. Therefore, in October, Davis announced a complete cotton embargo. The plan was to shut down Europe's textile industry, forcing them to intervene and end the federal blockade, hopefully alongside diplomatic recognition and military support. However, many European manufacturers had been stockpiling cotton for this eventuality, and the economic disruption was insufficient to force European intervention. However, it severely limited Confederate arms imports, to Johnson's chagrin. On the other side, Lincoln had less experience than Davis, but he was also aware of his deficiencies and had built a highly talented cabinet to compensate. Commanding General of the Army Winfield Scott always knew the war would be long and planned accordingly. On May 21st, Scott recommended expanding the blockade, completely sealing off the southern coast. 80,000 new professional army soldiers would isolate and then seize rebel strongholds along the Mississippi River. Surrounded and split, the rebellion would be squeezed to death as his forces moved inland. The press derisively called it the Anaconda Plan, criticism President Abraham Lincoln echoed. They expected a short, decisive war. Once Bull Run proved Scott correct, Lincoln adapted. Scott was too old and fat to command troops, and a new field general was needed. Major General George McClellan's success in Western Virginia had demonstrated the ability that earned him admission to West Point at the age of 15, so Scott summoned him to Washington. Lauded in the press as the young Napoleon, McClellan arrived on July 26th to roaring crowds, hopeful he would save the Union. Before giving him army command, Scott asked McClellan to propose his own plan to defeat the rebellion. Vindicating Scott, McClellan re-proposed Scott's plan with more details. In addition to the blockade and push down the Mississippi, McClellan added thrusts into the Confederacy through Virginia, the Carolina coast, Tennessee, and the Red River. Critical to the plan was bringing overwhelming force against the rebels at all points simultaneously. While building and equipping such a force required tremendous logistics, McClellan was confident of success. As chief engineer, then vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad, he'd developed into a logistical genius and set to work reforming the army with Lincoln's support. He organized supply centers, convinced his railway colleagues to prioritize military shipments, and rapidly expanded arms manufacturing. Constant drills, better food, and training improved morale. By August, the loose formations that had panicked at Bull Run were transformed into the formidable Army of the Potomac. Additionally, the whole military was reorganized. The new Federal Army would be composed of 3-year volunteers. Strategy would be dictated from Washington, but each army commander had operational freedom. Each military district would be centrally supplied and uniformly equipped to pre-war army standards with the latest model Springfield rifled musket or equivalent. Accepting his limited usefulness, Scott retired on November 1st, handing his job to McClellan. Lincoln was skeptical that one man could lead the main army while administering the entire war effort, but McClellan confidently told him, "I can do it all." Indeed, he'd successfully reorganized and streamlined the United States military's command structure, recruitment, and supply chain by December. However, organizing was all McClellan was doing. Other than occasional patrols verifying that Johnson was still entrenched around Centerville, his army was completely idle. This made Lincoln increasingly anxious. The Army of the Potomac alone cost $600,000 a day to maintain. Worse, the inactivity and general poor performance of federal forces during 1861 prompted Congress to begin investigating army failures and probing Lincoln's administration while demanding action. McClellan's reports were just demands for more resources and trust the process. The stress and uncertainty sent Lincoln into a depressive spiral. McClellan justified himself firstly by saying that his strategic plan called for a massive simultaneous offensive on all fronts, and most of those fronts weren't ready to attack. The Navy couldn't support the planned amphibious operations yet, and Western generals Henry Halleck and Don Carlos Buell weren't ready to move. The only option was to wait. Secondly, he was convinced that he was severely overmatched. His intelligence chief was Alan Pinkerton, a longtime friend. While his agents were adept at spy catching and infiltrating the Confederate government, as both were standard detective work, they were utterly useless at gathering military intelligence. They constantly misidentified fortifications and overestimated enemy numbers. Johnson's 70,000 soldiers behind simple breastworks were reported to McClellan as 170,000 behind strong fortifications, which he then passed on to Lincoln as 200,000 soldiers and impregnable fortifications to justify recruiting more soldiers. However, the real problem was McClellan's personality. Meticulous to the point of perfectionism, he refused to take any risk until all possible preparations had been made. However, preparing became a never-ending cycle, and McClellan was hopelessly lost in endlessly perfecting his army. McClellan
I think he was one of those people who he knew how to build an army, but I think he also got very attached to them individually. And so the fear of going into battle and losing those men that he loved just as much as they loved him, I think that was just gut-wrenching. And it was a possibility he did not actually want to do. It would have been better had he been put in charge of building units or, building militaries, and then somebody else took over control and used them. Because he was so good at what he did. But in terms of being a military leader, being out on the battlefield, he just was not.
Finally outlined plans to his innermost circle for an amphibious landing at Urbana to outflank Johnson and seize Richmond on January 11th. Lincoln, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, wasn't told, and on January 27th ordered all Union armies to begin offensive action before George Washington's birthday on February 22nd. When McClellan didn't respond, Lincoln ordered him to advance against Johnson immediately. McClellan responded with a 22-page memo detailing how that was impossible, and that his Urbana plan was better, the first time Lincoln learned it existed. Relieved, Lincoln relented. However, by March 8th, McClellan still hadn't moved. Consequently, Lincoln called McClellan's subordinates to the White House to learn if the plan was Consequently, Lincoln called McClellan. By March 8th, McClellan learned it existed. Relieved, Lincoln relented. However, by March 8th, McClellan.
So he was told February 22nd, you got to do something, and March 8th, he still hadn't done anything. Yeah.
Still hadn't moved. Consequently, Lincoln called McClellan's subordinates to the White House to learn if the plan was real and if they were confident in it. They answered yes to both, but Lincoln also learned that McClellan had never named commanders for the Army's corps, despite obsessively constructing them, so Lincoln appointed them himself. McClellan finally prepared to depart on March 9th, only to learn that Johnson had sniffed out the Urbana plan and withdrawn behind the Rappahannock. Consequently, Northern newspapers discovered that most of the Centerville defenses were fake. McClellan had been duped, wasting a valuable opportunity, especially since many Confederate enlistments had run out in February. Humiliated, McClellan decided to target the James Peninsula instead and sailed for Fort Monroe on March 17th. Meanwhile, another army was sent to the Shenandoah Valley, with 50,000 troops on standby in Alexandria to deploy as needed. Lincoln relieved McClellan as General of the Armies on March 11th, so he could focus on the campaign. McClellan's plan was to sprint behind Johnson, take Richmond, and then attack Johnson's rear. However, he sabotaged himself. McClellan refused to leave Fort Monroe until all his 121,500 soldiers arrived, giving Johnson ample time to redeploy while dispatching Stonewall Jackson to Shenandoah Valley. McClellan finally crawled forward on April 4th, meeting the 1st Confederate line at Lee's Mill the next day. Confederate Major General John Magruder spread his 11,000 troops thinly while marching them in circles, tricking McClellan into believing he faced 100,000 rebels. McClellan halted and prepared to besiege Yorktown. Magruder let McClellan believe the lie until May 3rd, when he withdrew during the night. Johnson planned a Fabian withdrawal up the peninsula before ambushing McClellan once he got strung out. On the 5th, his rearguard fought a successful delaying action outside Williamsburg. On the 7th, a Federal attempt to intercept the retreat via amphibious assault was contained at Eltham's Landing. The scuttling of ironclad CSS Virginia opened the James River, and Lincoln, visiting Fort Monroe to observe the campaign, ordered a naval attack on Richmond, but it was turned back by batteries on Drury's Bluff. On May 17th, Johnson's men retreated into Richmond's defences. McClellan had moved so slowly that he'd never strung out as Johnson expected. However, McClellan was now convinced he was outnumbered 2-1, when in reality he outnumbered Johnson 5-3. Again, he settled into siege lines, straddling the Chickahominy while screaming for all available reinforcements to be sent to him. The 5th Corps cleared Confederate detachments from Hanover Courthouse to open the road for the 1st Corps to rejoin the army. However, it had been diverted to counter Jackson, now running wild in Shenandoah Valley. Richmond could not withstand a siege.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. We'll be back with part 2. For people who wonder why, I break them down if they're over 25 minutes, because if it's a 25-minute video, the average length time is like 11 minutes. If it's shorter, like this will be 15 minutes, the average view time is like 7 or 8 minutes. So I'm just going for, I did a 3-hour video one time. The average view length was like 31 minutes. You just feel like you're wasting a lot of time, so I shorten the videos down. Some people don't like them. It's a time issue. Okay, so this is part 1. We'll be back with part 2. Until then, have a good day, have a good night.